So, you walk into Mr. B's 5th grade art class and you're feeling good. Susie just let you touch her right hip at lunch and wrote you a letter saying your breath smells a little bit like peanuts and sassafras. You were able to school Jimmy at Pokemon for a brand new Pog, which you just know are going to be worth a lot of money someday. Just like your Aunt Bessie stocking up on Beanie Babies for the inevitable market rush coming any day now. Only this isn't some ordinary day in Mr. B's 5th grade art class. The classroom sits in a basement, so usually only narrow windows allow a slant of light to come in, but today that's been completely darkened. The blinds are drawn. Mr. B's helper Fox is out for the day. You saw her smoking a cigarette, staring down at the ground, figure of gloom. You go to your locker, pull out your half-completed drawing of Charmander left in the rain. You sit down next to Susie and figure on another afternoon of scribbling on a desperate Charmander and flirting with Susie is underway. Despite the stuffy atmosphere Mr. B has set up in here, it really is stuffy. And why does Mr. B smell so funny? Mr. B comes into the room. He's got on a black turtleneck sweater, red corduroy pants, and pointed toe leather loafers. What is with Mr. B? His eyes are red. Has he been dabbling in the gateway drug Aunt Bessie says is the ruination of the American dream? Mr. B orders that everyone put their drawings away, so all comply. Papers are ruffled. A fart is mellowed in the scuffle. All grows silent. Mr. B looks around the room, nodding his head. He raises his hands above his head. He says, "Today, children, I will ask you one of the few key questions paramount to our understanding of human nature." Now this is some shit. This is something you half understand, and Johnny Two Toes Three Fingers is already pushing on his stomach to make the diarrhea come again. So Mr. B goes ahead and just looks at Johnny to let him know he's good to go cry and masturbate in the restroom for the day. However, for the rest of the classroom, including you, it's time to dip your toe into the murky cool water of adult life. We believe we have free will, Mr. B says. He's got a plastic skull out of a broom closet that has his brown sack lunch and a copy of the one play he was ever in called Shakespeare in Love, and it doesn't take any leap of logic to see the man as a failed lesbian who is and has an instinct for the theater. And hey, that smelly smell and that groovy fox looking depressed Susie next to you, this ain't so bad. We believe it, so it is. We have determined that one of the ways in which we enact free will is... Now for the line that gets Mr. B fired from 5th grade art class. And you see him years later and he owns a meditation retreat in California for convicted arsons. Suicide. Susie looks lightheaded. Dennis, the kind, says, "Way cool." Mr. B stares him into submission. "Get to the point, Mr. B. Half the viewers have already clicked off, and this art class was only a 30-minute period. The other evidence we have that suggests we have free will is art. We humans, rather than reproduce, hunt endlessly, sleep into hibernation, or drink to sickness, will instead indulge survival time towards entertainment, towards goofing off." Mr. B looks at Dennis again. "So, today's lesson, kids. A discussion. What is art?" Susie raises her hand. "Father says art is from God." Mr. B nods his head, says nothing. Susie went to the Catholic school for 4 years. She would say that. Dennis raises his hand. "Art is pretty pictures, books, stuff like that." Mr. B shrugs his shoulder and nods. "You raise your hand." Mr. B points at you. Kind of missing with his finger, but close enough. You go to answer. Johnny Two Toe and Three Fingers runs in, blasting off farts to propel himself forward. "These nuts!" In 2008, my dad walked in while still in flesh and blood and handed me a copy of a game called Fallout 3 that looked sort of weird, and I had no idea what it was except that it was a big deal. I booted up the Xbox 360, praying against a red ring, loaded up the disc, and for the first time since Morrowind, I was truly immersed. All while at the same time knowing this was a game far different, both in scope and context. 10 years later, I escaped into Fallout 3 because 10 years on, there's still something very special about leaving Vault 101 for the first time to see how Bethesda would bring the Fallout series into the 21st century. What was a controversial project mired in a legal battle, given years to simmer, and thought untranslatable to the modern audience, turned out to be anything but. Fallout 3 today and in 2008 is a marvel. The first time out of the vault, running into the high school, conveniently located just outside of Vault 101, having some filthy, raiders cussing me out, having bullets and dirt fly in my screen. Morrowind, this was not. The world has grown more dynamic, the illusion more complete. I was a high school kid helping my dad at work and doing 3 sports, but I found the time to sink into Fallout 3. It was a game worth sacrificing sleep for. Then I booted it up during the short lull I'd get between baseball and school, called August, and found I'd built my character into a useless and obscure build, on a save kept on a whim before beating the game because the vanilla release had the world come to an end after the main quest, fighting what was, to this day, one of the buggiest titles I've ever experienced. Lost in a cellar in Washington, D.C., and thus my experience with Fallout 3 came to a close 10 years ago. So, Morrowind, this was not. I didn't kill Vivek. I wasn't still knee-deep in exploration. I couldn't continue the power fantasy. I was lost in the metro tunnels of D.C. and their sea of gray. Whereas Morrowind had offered a varied and colorful world, in the end, maybe I just didn't understand Fallout 3. But was also beaten down by the game's insistence on bombed-out metros, and confused by its sudden and abrupt end. Still, the initial impression remained that this was a game that one would want to take with them if they were stuck on a desert island with only one game to play. Fallout 3 would be a good game, like a War and Peace. You know, you could dig your toes in and know that it offered enough variety to sustain itself for years to come. After we unlocked all the achievements on stream, and I've returned to this game periodically over the past 10 years, I still haven't seen all the Wasteland has to offer. Then in 2018, I'm a streamer with a few more lumps and a more cynical view of the industry. Not wished for, certainly. And while my jaw doesn't drop anymore when I run into those same raiders at the high school with their toupees and their stick necks attached to Barbie doll bodies like old, tired mannequins. The not-so-cute bugs like the pit on Xbox having broken textures so you can't explore the whole map, or the corrupted saves we encountered multiple times, I am still astounded by the achievement that Fallout 3 represents. It's more than it being the almost reboot of a legendary franchise which had fallen into production hell and many thought gone forever. Thanks to many bad decisions, it meant that Bethesda owned this game, and yes, it had a proven track record, but this is pre-Oblivion days. We're talking about a company known for some of the best open-world RPGs, but at the same time known for some of the worst bugs and stiff, unintuitive controls and design. It was an unknown just how Bethesda's reimagining would go. Was Fallout done for? Had Bethesda begun its own death spiral? Something that seems to be echoing today, sadly. 10 years later, we emerged from Vault 101, and Bethesda is the modern top-tier contender we know today. Yes, even post-76, Bethesda is still one of the big boys. What did impress me 10 years later, re-entering the capital wasteland, was being much better now at the game. No more designing myself into an obscure, largely useless build. I opened the wiki and got curious. I allowed myself to take it all in. Now better able to hold my own, the merits of Fallout 3 were more plainly clear. It is a survival game at its heart. It tries to make guns blazing an inferior tactic most of the time. It's a game that is a sandbox of decisions on how the Lone Wanderer will deploy themselves into this brilliant science fiction story of an alternate America and world ruined by a final cataclysmic war. It's a game that after multiple playthroughs and hundreds of hours, there's still more to do and more to see and more to see. This now ancient relic by video game standards opened the door, set the bar for what the open world game was and would be, and then lastly it opened the door to something else. Questions. I found myself in 2008 asking questions to help the slavers or to enslave, sure, but as I got to know the NPCs and hear their stories, the questions gained a little more weight. This wasn't, as a theory of fun puts it, in the context of GTA and killing prostitutes, a simple power-up any longer. Though in 2018 able to navigate the game better, a little more learned by being knocked down a couple pegs by teachers who stared me down like a ranch hand stares down a heifer, I began to question the decisions even more. That's how I started to reach a conclusion on Fallout 3, and my conclusion was, it's a work of art. A statement I return to with video games often, as they have yet to be respected in a cultural way in this regard. They are stowed away in a privately funded video game museum. That's the extent to which culturally they are given merit. There's been cursory moves towards getting older games copyright protections. However, as of making this, we have yet to build as a nation a national archive for video games, like we have for film and American letters. Not only do I think this can be a worthwhile endeavor for digital media, I believe it will heighten the platform to greater pursuits. There ought to be a clause, no microtransactions, no piecemeal mandatory DLC. A game is judged by its merits in programming, sound design, animation, and lastly its capacity to either contribute to society or to ask questions of it. This latter is where Fallout 3 succeeds. This was where the game had stepped upon territory that would make it worthy of being recorded in this as-yet fictional National Archive for Digital Media. Like Mr. B in 5th grade, this game decides to ask us questions. Namely, what is a nation? Is it a set of common slogans and symbols, or is it a set of virtues? In the vein of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, Fallout asks us, is the high road still worthy in a world gone wrong? One must ask themselves to sacrifice profit for the pursuit of virtue. Fallout 3 asks these questions gingerly at first, as the lone wanderer likely runs into Brian Wilkes in the quest Those, an ode to 1950s B films, and one of its crowning achievements, Them. Like most things in Fallout, this quest does double duty. It serves to ground the player in the retrofuturism, 1950s, 60s America, our setting, the nuclear family, control of the atom. Then grows sinister. The writing for such a simple quest is well delivered, by providing a punch at the end. The lone wanderer gets the excitement of a new power-up, seeing some giant ants in this horrible everything gone wrong world, then must make a decision on the orphan Brian. The lone wanderer may get to see that Grey Ditch is considered a town, for having had a whopping 2 whole families. The human populace is not hanging on by much in the DC wastelands. Further, that a child here is nothing short of a miracle. So what does one do with the child? Their options are numerous, but the two extremes are handing Brian to his aunt in Rivet City, whereupon Brian is given a sense of hope, confidence, and takes you as a hero and aspires to be good, or selling him into slavery, which will make him call you a son of a bitch and say fuck you, when his father told him not to cuss. So you see in the raw the ruination of a child. Thus, the player feels early and often that actions have consequences, and there is something truly reprehensible in ruining Brian. I cover this decision in our evil playthrough on this very YouTube. In Fallout 3, evil is evil. It'll often get you into trouble, making quests void to you, closing up whole options. It's punishing, and often the game is stacked heavily in favor of being good. Yet at the same time, the player is able to create scenarios Fallout 4 wasn't willing to go towards. What ultimately comes through, starting from this moment, is that evil is easy. It's violent and reactionary. It destroys. It gives power, and easily if you have the strength. But at what cost? A child's optimism? The lone wanderer may next run into Megaton, and the decisions here are of course legendary. To take Mr. Brooks' offer, with few textures and aged modeling, a character that still comes across as a complete and sinister creep, and blow up Megaton for Mr. Tenpenny, a man who is hard-coded into the game files as full evil, very evil, the only character in the game that can be murdered outright for good karma, or accept the cult of Adam as harmless, the prostitution and the drug den of Mortieri as the cost of doing business and civilization maybe, and Lucas Sims' I am the law, make it up as you go along attitude and settle in to help the city. On a design level, the player is squandering a lot of opportunity by turning evil. Again, the game scales against the bad path. You're losing a storage locker and a constant supply of caps by providing scrap steel to the town. However, in this early stage, the player may be desperate for caps and will still receive a place to rest and unload their loot by going to Tenpenny. However, the signs are clear. The consequence is larger. Finding Brian's aunt would have saved a child, but it took more work for less reward than a simple slave collar. The result? Grey Ditch to burned out ruin. An aunt who is ostensibly the last of her family, and one of a child, and now one nephew poor. However, caps in your pocket. A quest solved in minutes. Megaton blown up. No dilemmas with the Church of Adam, labeled local cult, and no need of repair or explosive skill. Press a button, big boom, get paid. Of course, in the long run, what the player has managed to do is wipe even more people off the map, and left behind a miserable few in the tower who know little of life outside it. In fact, one might just be so turned off by the arrogant aristocracy inside the town, even Herbert Daring Dashwood knew his sidekick Argyle, a ghoul, as his manservant. The slave trade is a crucial aspect of Fallout 3's theme. The question it asks upon its audience knowingly or not. In the Elder Scrolls games, slavery is an issue of racism. It being fantastical, the social commentary is clear, but the implications don't matter. It's just a thing with Elder Scrolls. So being frustrated by the callous Tenpenny, his worshipper Burke, or perhaps just murderous on purpose, one can follow Roy Phillips into his hole in the earth, one of Fallout 3's regrettable gray-green metro mazes that link DC, and he'll want to get into Tenpenny. One of the most morally gray quests plays out with Roy Phillips. The evil path, the simple simple path, as usual, is to just let the feral ghouls rip the citizens to pieces while they're still alive. Or the good path, that sees the player trying to resolve with residents to forget and move on with their prejudice that you can simmer. And Roy Phillips, who is encoded oddly enough into the game's file as good, will be able to move into Tenpenny. However, he will decide, after what he claims is an altercation, to murder every resident and freeze them in the tower's basement. An act bad enough that even a sympathizer like Three Dog blasts him for it on the radio. Which, by the way, is one of the best design and narrative choices Fallout 3 makes to create a more dynamic and alive world than Morrowind. Morrowind, for all its brilliance, just fails to evolve and adapt adequately to how the player has changed the world. Fallout 3 is able to realize and provide feedback to the player in a more robust manner by both surface details, Megaton becoming a radioactive crater, for instance, and in the undercurrent by having Three Dog comment every step of the way on the Lone Wonder. This was one of the most motivating factors for me in both good and bad playthroughs, was just hearing Three Dog's reaction to the Lone Wonder's actions on the radio. My favorite of these was in the Evil playthrough, his claim that our character was nothing but an urban myth, fake news. Three Dog will be giving reports in his already desperate way to fewer and fewer people, as an evil character is able to turn the last few lights still twinkling to a smolder, while the man in the radio booth says it's just a myth. Moving forward, the diversity any single lone wanderer may take through the Capital Wasteland is already apparent. From just these early moments, one wanderer has bolstered a town and helped its water supply, saved an orphan boy, adding to Rivet City's populace, then had their idealism take a hit with Roy Phillips. This is the only time I found a Fallout 3 good playthrough to be punishing, when the player errs towards being too idealistic. They must still remember, we're talking about the post-apocalypse here. Whereas the other has destroyed that city, enslaved that boy, and fed Tenpenny to the ghouls. The ghouls of the non-feral variety still seem to hate you, by the way. This is only the foundation to the questions Fallout 3 opens up. They state plainly and vividly that there is good and there is evil. I did not feel neutral was well defined in Fallout 3, except neutral meant being inert. This differs from New Vegas, where I'm finding its faction system means neutrality has real consequence. The next step in the equation is to cement the two most needed resources in the Capital Wasteland, or in all human civilization for that matter, labor and water. Further, if these things are secured, who controls them, and how? Fallout 3 would just be a good role-playing game with some nasty bugs and a world that begs for some variety in its color palette if it were not for the next things the Lone Wanderer chances upon. A small settlement sits on the edge of a vast irradiated territory, and a child greets you, and thus the player chances upon one of Fallout 3's many unmarked quests. These really could have been tracked in the notes, because like Morrowind without a guide, these are not plainly obvious at all, and the player really misses out on some of the best storytelling in the game. The Republic of Dave's leader is, you guessed it, Dave. The Lone Wanderer has stumbled upon the Republic of Dave on Election Day. Wow, a real democracy, eh? Dave will task the Lone Wanderer with the quest of rounding up the voters so that Election Day can be over and done with. The player will discover that everything isn't ideal in the Republic of Dave. Who'da thunk it? But most from Dave's second wife, his sycophant bodyguard, and the young host of the Republic of Dave's museum support their president. However, Dave's first wife was the leader of a caravan much larger than this republic and led them through the dangerous wastes. The Lone Wanderer convinces Rosie to run for office. Dave accepts, granting this is a democracy after all. While not thrilled with the idea, the cleverness of this quest, and why it is my personal favorite, is that Dave is a dictator. This is the People's Republic of North Korea. Yet, he allows Rosie to run against him, and for others to vote for Rosie if they'd like. And if a free election is allowed to occur, Dave does win, fairly. However, knowing that Dave is an autocrat with a shady past, the Lone Wanderer can choose to stuff the ballot box and rig the election. The player, good or evil, is faced with one of the few questions in Fallout 3 that doesn't equate moral righteousness with being helpful, and evil being hurtful. These aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, with the exception of the pit, which I'll not divulge much on here, but has another such situation with no right answer. As a good player, I stuffed the box. Rosie would free the people. She had a true democracy in mind. But to do it, I had to rig the election. Is that democracy at all? Was that truly the right choice? The Lone Wanderer moves on from his travels and experiences within the Republic of Dave, and what they are left with is not green, blue, purple loot and a shiny level up, but a nagging moral question. Yes, the game design mechanics still work here. You have to stealth to stuff the box, you get a new rifle of high quality called Old Painless. All the while, you just made a morally questionable decision, and it impacted another one of the rare human settlements in the Capital Wasteland. Now, the traveler continues forward and comes upon a bombed-out structure with its foundation built of concrete still strong. They've barricaded the gates and seem to have built themselves a fortress. This place is called, fittingly, Temple of the Union. For those Americans listening, the words are going to carry meaning. Inside a group of escaped slaves from Paradise Falls who, rather than blend in and hide like others, have chosen to lead an underground railroad and seek to free other slaves. Their leader Hannibal makes you swear allegiance to their cause. Either way, the player is still going to have the freedom to make a decision here. Inside the Temple of the Union is the severed stone head of Lincoln. Fallout 3 doesn't skip out or back down from bringing forth the most epic and heaviest symbols they can. This quest, Head of State, will lead the player to the Lincoln Memorial, where we see that Lincoln, despite an otherwise intact memorial, has been decapitated. Decapitated by slavers in their attempt to erase the past. Erasing the past. Here the lone wanderer, if evil, can not only erase the small sliver of a chance that slaves have, but manage to extinguish from history's record the fundamental ideas of the United States, our sacred union, of liberty, freedom, and hope. Or, if good, they may restore the memorial and give Hannibal the relics, and have him become a safe keeper of the Civil War, the fight for freedom and paid labor, uniform citizenship, regardless of race, religion, creed, or sex. These heavy decisions are the layers upon which the basic question of good and evil sprout. How do we govern ourselves in a world gone sparse and brutal? Can our highest values and temperaments still survive the barbarity, or are they luxuries? We skip forward in time, and the lone wanderer, gone on many journeys, now faces the final test. Who gets the water? Now, this final segment, I encourage the viewer, if they're going for their first trek or a return voyage into the capital wasteland, to have Broken Steel installed. Broken Steel is a fitting epilogue which will take the player on a quest that sees everything wrapped up nicely, regardless of what side they choose here. It feels like the final tour, and does a good job of returning to many of the same themes prevalent in the vanilla Fallout 3. One of these images that constantly sprouts up in both Broken Steel's Tour of America's Sad Remnants and the American Dream quest, all of the main quest is fittingly named and excellently woven, by the way, is Thomas Jefferson. No other founder's statue is visible in the game, certainly not as prominent anyway, as dead center of your next decision is a still standing statue of our gray man. By his being specifically prominent, Bethesda is cluing us in a little. This is the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, another work featured prominently in this game. The same Thomas Jefferson who wrote, "Citizens have certain inalienable rights, and rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others." Yes, Bethesda does skew the game in favor of good, and ultimately this is to its strength. They want and hope you'll deliver the water to the people as free and rightful, and while the Brotherhood might not be perfect, they are by far the lesser of the two evils in this case. This is where Bethesda's Fallout and Fallout 3 stand apart. The old school defends the classic's lack of theme to its strength, and yet all I see is the industrial noise and the hopelessness is one message: violence, animal instinct, cruelty. Define us and define the world we've built and will end on. It's a non-theme. It's video games in a nutshell. Pew pew. At best, it's nihilism, and that's a stretch. These are games that play well, were fundamental to there being a Fallout 3, and have many, many merits, but they are not art, to my mind, because they do not ask questions of their audience. They offer an excellent entertainment and escape, yet Susie Dennis and Mr. B aren't going to be stirred one night by a strange notion and think about what it all meant. Fallout 3 is one of those games. Someday, long after you've played it, you could be popping a bottle with a friend around a campfire, lying alone in your bed at night thinking, and it will happen across your mind, what was Fallout trying to say? Fallout 3 asks, in its final decision, the final conflict of Brotherhood of Steel versus Enclave, what's more important? Flags and slogans, or ideas? Is the Enclave, with their great technology and claim to being the United States government, worth allegiance to when they stand for all the things we were the opposite of, just because they wave the flag? Or were we always more than just our trinkets? Were we the people who elected the sensitive intelligence of Lincoln? Were we the people who birthed and hard-fought freedom on the principles of liberty by our founding fathers? Fallout 3's boldness is a fearless decision to allow the player to make that former decision. Being evil means eradicating the few settlements left, and if not killing their people, putting them in serious jeopardy. It means erasing history and propagating the new Dark Age, and ultimately of vanquishing hope. If it wasn't willing to go there, the message fails. The game is dogmatic, okay, but on the flip side, what choosing the good side represents is that even if you've chosen good and tried to be a force of justice in the world, you may not notice it all that much, and it's significantly harder to be just than it is evil. You may have given Brian Wilkes a mom, okay? Megaton kept the status quo, whoop-de-doo. And you set up some ill-prepared slaves around a memorial they half understood, and they're probably going to be dead in a week. But at least you came by this way but once and did what good you could. I kept returning to one film, Night of the Living Dead. With the passing of George Romero, we always know his legacy is secure because his film, Night of the Living Dead, was put into the National Film Archive. Night of the Living Dead is a flawed masterpiece I've seen well over 100 times and returned to it again and again. The questions at its foundation are accessible. What would you do? How would you survive? Then, much like Fallout 3 or the entire genre in general, the question becomes at what cost? Is the sacrifice worth personal survival? Is the sacrifice worth not only your personal survival, but is it worth the human race's survival? Is it worth? And finally, to me, do you value your physical body over your soul? However, this is just my personal interpretation, and that to me is art. Any work that is done well enough that it offers anyone who consumes it, from an illiterate gypsy in Timbuktu, someone with a doctor's degree in philosophy, the ability to consume it and form an opinion, because it asks questions of you. It allows you to think. They are works that ask us questions, but do so in such a manner that they don't require any answer. You can think or not. The door has just been opened for you. This holds true for another flawed masterpiece, Fallout 3. Whereas I might see a game that asks the questions of values over symbols, then all that flow from that question, all you many lone wanderers out there, may see entirely different questions. And this is how Mr. B, all those years ago, can draw the blinds down and smoke a little grass, trying to get to the crux of it all with us kids. Fallout 3 is hard to put a score on. It has so many flaws, yet for its time it set the bar, and to this day it is a riveting game. A game that is aging well enough, maybe not graphically, but like few other works in our medium, I believe that Fallout 3 must be preserved at the federal level for posterity. In fact, any game that has either presented the artistic merit, technological leaps, or design elegance needs to be kept for the record. They need saved and resaved and saved again. They must be kept. They must be kept with the film negatives and our letters and our drawings and our paintings as part of the tapestry that we created. That, like our greatest president once said, that they may not perish from this earth, so that even if a Fallout 3 occurred deep in some bunker, a super mutant like Fox might hear and see and feel what we are. Then if this nation may perish, at least our values would not.